Are we live? Is this thing on? Can never tell with the delay. Welcome back to what is this? PHIL-1006 at Fanshawe in the summer of 2020. Let me just check that my volume levels are working. How's everything here? Sound looks good. I'm feeling a little rough around the edges, I won't lie. It's very hot. I have a 9-month-old at home. She's very cute, but she's teething. With the delay. And welcome back. As a result, nobody's sleeping that great. PHIL-1006. I think I was just listening to myself live streaming in my incognito window. So let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about where we are in this class, because we're actually very close to wrapping up. The second essay, the instructions have been available for a little while. I see that I'm still waiting on submissions. You have till the weekend. Please submit it by June 14th. It's the folder won't close. You can still submit it after the 14th. And if you've been in those discussion forums, don't even worry about being like a day, maybe even 2 days late. If you're going to be more than like 48 hours late, send me an email, tell me what's up, and just kind of explain to me what's happening, and we can talk about how much time you need. The other thing that I probably should point out to you, let's go over to quizzes. All right, so we have online quiz 4, final test, which we'll be opening, right? So please get on top of those quizzes. So that's pretty much what's left, right? Your second essay, the instructions are there. You can propose your own topic, by the way. I was very impressed by your first papers. And honestly, if there's something you want to work on, something from the book or the slides that interests you, just work on that. Just propose a topic to me. Send me an email. Let me know what you want to work on, and I'll get back to you. So quizzes, final test, paper, and you're done. Let's get to the actual content then. Oh, it's over here. All right, so this module is on something called Analytic Philosophy. It's the kind of school I was trained in, mostly during my master's in PhD work. It's the school I'm most interested in. So I'm going to try not to get too deep into the weeds here, and just kind of see if I can give like a basic overview, because otherwise I could talk about this for days. What do we mean when we say analytic philosophy? If we're thinking about kind of the sociology of the discipline, the history of the discipline in the 20th century, what happens is roughly kind of a split in approaches. And in many places, it actually turned into a split of departments themselves. And if you wanted to study one or the other, you had to think about what you were actually applying to, which department you would be applying to in the same university, right? For example, at Western, if you're interested in analytic philosophy, you should just apply to the regular philosophy department. If you're interested in continental philosophy, there's a department called theory and criticism. Some schools focus more on one than the other. But what is the split? So analytic philosophy is really kind of the tradition that follows out of the kind of logical approach that we discussed during the module on the revolution in logic, the kind of Frege-Russell school. It focuses largely on logical analysis, science, mind, language. It also, of course, it still does ethics, often in the utilitarian tradition, or or kind of in kind of a neo-Kantian tradition. There's also, obviously, there's political science, but it's clearly done in a different style than the Continentals. The Continentals are also talk about ethics and morality and politics, but they also do aesthetics and existentialism. They talk more about subjective experience. They're more critical about the limits of the ideas of modernity and reason, especially after the Second World War, where it seemed that a too narrow focus on just rationality itself didn't lead us to a reasonable world. And I'll be talking about that in the next module when I talk a little bit more about continental philosophy. I know some people bristle when they hear the idea that you can critique rationality. Isn't rationality the best thing ever? But I think of it in terms of ever see Jurassic Park, right? You have Jeff Goldblum's character, the scientist, saying You scientists spend so much time thinking about whether you could do it, you never thought about whether you should do it. And that's kind of the critique we're aiming at, that hyper-rationality outside of other elements of the human experience can lead to really advanced techniques in science, but not a lot of stopping and thinking about what are we doing with the things, the tools that we've created. So instead of Frege and Russell being kind of the touchstones here, continental philosophers are going to take a lot more from Hegel, from Kierkegaard, from Nietzsche, and their kind of reactions to the philosophy of Kant. These are enormous simplifications, but just to give you an idea, right? There's a really deep split in the discipline in the 20th century. It's less significant now, but if you were going to grad school, even as late as I was, I defended my PhD in 2015. The idea in my analytic department, continental thinkers were often kind of looked down upon. These are the thinkers you might actually hear criticized sometimes by like internet personalities, people like, what's his name? Jordan Peterson, I think. So he sometimes criticizes Derrida and Foucault. And these are very common criticisms. I'm not a big fan of Peterson's forays into philosophy. I don't think he really has expertise in the topic when he talks about these things specifically. But if you've been online and you've seen these debates about Foucault, Derrida, and thinkers, Horkheimer, these are kind of continental philosophers. It's not the stuff I studied in grad school. Okay, enough throat clearing. When I'm really tired and I haven't slept, I tend to ramble. I hope that's okay. I'm keeping an eye on that comment box over here, so for my viewers, if there are any, you can just shout out, say hi, ask any questions. Let's get back to analytic philosophy. Up here, looking a bit like a geriatric turtle, is Bertrand Russell. Down here is Frege. And of course, Frege and Russell made the, together with a number of other people working in the 19th century, made really significant contributions to logic, the most significant since Aristotle 2,000 years prior. This led to really profound work in math and computer science, which is beyond the scope of the course. But if you enjoy your computers and your smartphones and your video games, the history of the development of the computer is really inextricable from the history of analytic philosophy in the 19th and 20th century. There's a lot of collaboration, kind of note sharing and things like that. In grad school, because I was going to an analytic school, right, I 100% had to study the computer science greats of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, from Gödel to von Neumann to, of course, Alan Turing, people like that. I had one foot in computer science and mathematics, another foot in philosophy. And this kind of the new logic, this sudden great progress in logic, led to this mid-20th century movement called logical positivism, which is kind of like the most analytic philosophy you can think of. So there was a tremendous excitement about the new logic, and immediately philosophers believed started to apply these tools, thinking with these tools we can finally solve philosophical problems. So logical positivism was a view that said, look, it's also called sometimes logical empiricism, so it's very much an empiricist view, not a rationalist view. The idea is you're going to ground knowledge and solve philosophical troubles, roughly, by doing two things. You're going to ground knowledge in direct sense perception plus logical inference. So what we have is sense perception plus the new logic gets you a new kind of empiricism that will be able to do what the empiricism of, say, Locke and Hume wasn't able to do. Logical positivism's most kind of fundamental slogan or statement is that the meaning of a sentence is its method of verification. Let me say that again. The meaning of a sentence is its method of verification. So how you find out that something is true is what the meaning of a sentence is. The meaning of a sentence is its verification conditions, right? So you might think, well, the meaning of a sentence can't just be how I verify it. Well, it's the set of conditions under which it's true is one way to think about it. So I can say something like, what is the meaning of snow is white? Well, snow is white is true if and only if snow is actually white. How do I verify that? I just go out and look. Something like that, right? So the converse of that is that if a statement has no specifiable verification conditions, it is literally meaningless. It's maybe poetry at best, but it's not a meaningless statement. It's not a meaningful statement. It's just a meaningless statement, and we don't need to have a debate about it because it's meaningless. It's just and we know there are statements. So think back to the slides last week about the revolution in logic, where I said, look, the new logic says there are statements that can be true or false, right? The propositions was a technical term, like, the sky is blue can be true or false. It's true. And there are statements that can't have a truth condition. They can't be true or false, like an exclamation, like ouch. Is ouch true or false? It's not a proposition. A question also, right? People have done heroic efforts trying to turn questions into, translate them into propositions, because they clearly have meaning. But meaningful in this sense means that, right, if we're going to argue and debate about it as philosophers, as scientists, we're going to say that things must have verification conditions, at least in principle, otherwise they're meaningless, right? So assertions or propositions that could be in principle verified through science were meaningful, right? So if I say something like, look, there's a teacup buried somewhere on Mars, that is a meaningful assertion because I can tell you in principle how to go verify that, right? Just go through Martian sand, send a few robots. It could take millennia until you check the whole planet, but in theory, I can tell you how to check that. So I know that it's a meaningful statement because I know there are verification conditions, even though they might be really difficult. If I say something more like that sounds more kind of pseudo-profound, like the cosmic womb of potential is a metaphysical place of creation. Well, how would we empirically verify if the sentence is true or false? What experiment, what observation could confirm or disconfirm it? So what a logical positivist would say is that if you can't tell me exactly the conditions under which the statement is true and the conditions under which the statement is false and how to go about it, even if I can't do the experiment practically, but if you can't tell me what the experiment or observation would be, this is a meaningless statement, right? This is poetry, this is abstract art, but it is not a meaningful statement. And what the logical positivist, the reason this is important for the logical positivist is that they're going to try to approach philosophical problems and figure out if there are verification conditions, and if there are no verification conditions, they're going to say this is not philosophy, this is not what we're supposed to be doing as philosophers, right? Because you're engaging in something meaningless, right? Here's a dinosaur comics that kind of explains the idea of logical positivism, right? Also called verificationism, logical empiricism, right? And a criticism here. So as T-Rex summarizes, right, if there's no verification, the sentence is meaningless, right? If it can't be checked, there's no use considering it. But how does anyone know that's true? Because of science? Come on. Science is about being accurate, which may not be the same thing as being true. Your senses could be lying to you, right? If you're a verificationist, you're going to need a pretty impregnable definition of truth. But I can't verify that my senses are liars. That my senses. So, dinosaur comics often talks about philosophical concepts like this. It's a nice kind of primer on it. So, one of the most famous logical positivists was a guy called Rudolf Carnap, 1891-1970. So we're getting really into very recent times. He argued that we could eliminate pseudo-problems and get rid of like weird metaphysical theories entirely. We wouldn't need to talk about Platonic forms, because how do you verify that they're Platonic forms? You can't, so don't talk about it. And he says, again, this is a very nice statement of logical positivism, saying like, look, the development of modern logic has made it possible to give a sharper answer to the question of the validity and justification of metaphysics. Right? And this leads to a positive and a negative result. What are these results? Well, the positive result is worked out in the domain of empirical science. Right? We have concepts that are clarified, their connections are made explicit. But in the domain of metaphysics, value, normative theory, it yields a negative result. The statements in this domain are meaningless. A radical elimination of metaphysics is attained. Right? So we're simplifying philosophy terribly because we found out we can't right? How do we verify the statement that, for example, through, say, Kant, who says, right, that the categorical imperative is that you should always treat people as ends of themselves. How do you verify that? You can't. Technically, it's a meaningless statement. And Carnap concludes, our conjecture is that metaphysics is a substitute for art. And for example, the metaphysician who had artistic talent to the highest degree, Nietzsche, avoided the error of the confusion of art for truth. Right? In the work, we expresses most strongly that which others express through metaphysics or ethics, or to like a false systematic method. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, right? If you remember, so that's a famous book of Nietzsche's. He does not choose a misleading theoretical form, but openly the form of art or poetry. So for Carnap, anything that is basically not verifiable using empiricism, using observation plus logic, is art. And there's nothing wrong with art, but you can mislead people by putting your art in the form of a theory expressing things that claim to be objectively true, but that's a mistake. And Carnap singles out Nietzsche, saying Nietzsche didn't make that mistake, right? Because instead of offering him a system, right, justified through rationality or attempts at rationality, a system that could be true or false, Nietzsche does a better thing. He just becomes a poet. He becomes a writer, right? These are expressions of an attitude towards life, Carnap says. This is a really radical doctrine that just gets rid of almost all philosophy and says, no, you're artists. You don't realize you're artists, but you guys are artists. Okay, so that's Carnap. Again, these are really radical views. Another radical view came out of a young man called Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was born in 1889, 1951. This dude, really interesting guy, born into an extremely wealthy Viennese family. His brother Paul Wittgenstein was a famous concert pianist who lost his arm in World War I, and the family, we're talking really, really rich family, commissioned some of the great composers of the time to write piano suites for one hand. He inherited the family fortune, I think, in the 1920s, gave it almost all away, and aspired to nothing else but like a simple, good life. Thought he'd solved philosophy after he wrote his first book, became like a school teacher in rural Austria, came back to philosophy when he realized he made some mistakes. There's a great biography of his life called, I think, The Duty of Genius. I'm sorry, I get excited by Wittgenstein because he's one of my favorite philosophers, and I wrote my master's thesis on him, on his work. So let me just get into who Wittgenstein was. Clearly also an important analytic philosopher, one of the first people establishing the basic ideas of logical positivism and then criticizing it. So the later work, which I'm going to kind of focus on. Do I have slides about his early work? I do. But the later work argued against some of the basic assumptions of his analytic contemporaries. One of the big things he disagreed about was the view that language represents reality, that the role of language is to kind of picture reality. And this meant that logical analysis will not work the way the positivists had hoped. Unfortunately, you won't be able to eliminate metaphysics the way they'd hoped, because the primary goal of language is not to represent reality, it's to do things, to act in reality. This is pretty interesting, and it kind of makes sense that the logical positivist kind of approach wouldn't work, because if I go back to verificationism and I say, look, the meaning of a sentence is its verification conditions, and if you can't tell me the verification conditions, it's meaningless, stop and think about what are the verification conditions of verificationism. In other words, take the slogan, the meaning of a sentence is its method of verification. How do I verify whether that's true? How do I find out that verificationism is true? What experiment am I going to run? What observations plus logic is going to tell me that it's true that the meaning of a sentence is its verification conditions? Right? There's no experiment for verificationism. So the whole thing is a little self-contradictory. That's one of the problems that they struggled with, one of the things Wittgenstein was trying to warn us about. So we have an early and a late Wittgenstein. Early Wittgenstein pretty much got the ball rolling on logical positivism. Right? He was a soldier and then a prisoner of war in World War I. He, much like a lot of the kind of early analytic philosophers, early logical positivists, want to solve philosophy through logic. He gives a general account of propositional form. Now, a proposition, of course, is a logical statement capable of being true or false that we could really precisely express using logic. So if he gives a general account of the form of the proposition, what you're going to be effectively doing is delineating the exact limits of language, of thought itself, of science, of what can be expressed and what cannot be expressed and must be passed over in silence, as he puts it. So the Tractatus, which is early Wittgenstein attempting to do logical positivism, says, look, reality is a set of facts that exist in a logical space of all possible facts, like an infinitely large space of all possible things that could be true or false. Reality is a subset of all possible true facts. Now, a proposition asserts that some state of affairs hold. So it says, of the total possible facts, this one is true. And we do this in language by picturing the facts. The legend has it that Wittgenstein kind of came up with this idea when he was observing a court case of a very early traffic accident in the 1910s. And what the lawyers did, they actually had like a little pictogram of the scene, like a little toy car smashing into another one, kind of explaining to the audience how the accident occurred. And this picturing of the scenario was kind of mirrored in the Tractatus. It says the role of language is to picture reality. And this is exactly the view Wittgenstein is going to criticize later on. He's going to say, no, language doesn't picture reality. That was a mistake I made. But in his early work, he says, language pictures reality. And what is reality? Facts in logical space. And much like Locke, right, we have complex propositions, which we decompose into simpler ones, ultimately into the logical atoms, the smallest pieces of the language. However, Wittgenstein says, we can't fully comprehend the nature of picturing through the picture itself. Right? It can't explain itself fully. Right? At the end of his book, he says, that ultimately you have to kind of understand that this is what you're doing, but I can't explicitly show it. So the Tractatus, like many of the early logical positivists, actually had a Kantian bent to it, in that there's a distinction between kind of a phenomenal reality, what can be said through language, which is the limits of what is possible and sensible to say. So language takes the role in the picture of kind of the old Kantian metaphysics, of like the mind's kind of like perception structuring reality, instead it's language structures what can be sensibly said. And there's things that just can't be said, which must be passed over in silence. So later on, the later Wittgenstein criticizes this. He says, look, I made a mistake. The picture theory that language pictures facts is wrong. Language is not representational in the sense that language represents reality. Instead, but this is really interesting about the investigations. So the early Wittgenstein thought he could solve philosophy by limiting the expression of sensible things to a certain class of picture propositions, like that we're picturing logical space we're picturing logical space through language, and then we know how to evaluate these. But so I've solved philosophy. We're done. Later, Wittgenstein comes back 20 years later, maybe 10 years later, and says, look, I made a mistake. But we've still solved philosophy, so the goal is the same. In both cases, he says we should stop. We've solved most of the problems of philosophy. But however, what we need to understand is that language isn't a picture. It isn't representational. What we need to do is not solve philosophical problems, but dissolve them. We need to dissolve them by doing this radical thing, which is say that meaning is use. The meaning of language is its use in a cultural, social context, because that's the kind of creatures we are. We are not robots picturing reality through words. right? We are human beings navigating complex worlds, plural, social worlds, cultural worlds, virtual worlds, and what we're doing is we're trying to do things with language. And philosophical problems occur when we don't realize that we're using words and we try to understand our usage as if every usage was a theory, which is wrong. Let me talk a little bit about this. All right, so Wittgenstein says meaning isn't verification, meaning isn't a picture, language isn't like a mock-up of reality, it's not a representation, meaning is use. We use language to do all kinds of things. This means our concepts, our very thoughts, are not going to have precise definitions, right? The closest thing we have to definition is maybe like clusters of features, which change over time, evolving as usage changes, as our interest in the world changes. But there are no strict definitions, right? This is in contrast with Plato, right? The whole point of Platonic metaphysics, right, the whole point of Socratic questioning was that we need to find out what justice is with a capital J. We need to find out what knowledge is. And the goal of the philosopher is to find out the true Platonic essence, the universal form of the concept. Right? But Wittgenstein says there are no philosophical problems. You don't need to do this. Meaning doesn't refer to some abstract Platonic universal entity. Meaning is use. Meaning is what we use language to do. It changes over time. Concepts don't have precise meanings. They don't need to. All right, so the later philosophy is almost an anti-philosophy. He says it's a form of therapy. We don't answer questions, we unask the questions that lead us to philosophize, right? It's a bit like a philosophical question for Wittgenstein is a bit like a leading question that we should refuse to answer. Like the old, there's an old joke, like, have you stopped beating your dog yet? It's an awful example, I'm sorry. But have you stopped beating your dog implies, if you say yes, you admit you've been beating your dog. If you say no, you admit you're still beating your dog. So what you should do is unask the question. I reject the premise of this question, which is what Wittgenstein wants us to do for philosophy. He says, the real discovery is the one that makes me capable of stopping. Right? It's no longer tormented by questions, which bring itself into question. Right? How do we do this? We recognize that philosophical problems arise when language kind of goes on holiday. When we stop doing the right thing, which is just realizing meaning is use, and then try to theorize too much about language, try to imagine that language's job is to picture, that language's job is to refer to Platonic entities. None of these things are true. Meaning is use. And as a result, there is no puzzle about the real nature of justice. There is no real puzzle about the real nature of knowledge with a capital K. There's only usage. And usage is kind of self-justifying because if you're able to communicate, you're done. If people understand you and we use these words and we're able to accomplish our ends in the world, then meaning justifies itself through our actions. Right? And a lot of philosophical puzzles to this day are generated by asking us like, oh yes, but what is a cheeseburger really? Is a hot dog a sandwich? And then you can kind of get these debates about like, well, I don't know, what is a sandwich really? But the fact is, in ordinary language, we don't worry about these things. Right? And it's a mistake to start worrying about them because then we're applying a scientific theory to language, but it doesn't work. That's not what language is. Language is not a scientific theory of the world. Science is a scientific theory of the world, and sometimes science uses language as a tool. But language itself is not a scientific theory of the world. So here's an example. How am I doing for time? I feel like I've been ranting for like an hour. I've got a couple of viewers. So here's an example of what we mean by meaning is use. I've been very abstract so far. Consider the word game. Now for Plato, right, I can imagine Socrates in the ancient Athenian agora going like, oh, you're talking about the Olympic Games, Cratylus, but what is a game really? Oh, I didn't ask you for examples. I want to know what the essence of game is, the form of game, the idea of game. If Wittgenstein could speak ancient Greek and you dropped him into Athens, he and Socrates would probably come to blows. Wittgenstein was legendarily temperamental. Very bad attitude, Wittgenstein. Definitely bad temper. There's a book called Wittgenstein's Poker where Karl Popper, who came up with the idea of scientific falsifiability, very much a positivist idea, and Wittgenstein kind of almost come to blows in the common room at Oxford. And it's Wittgenstein's poker, because it's a fire poker, not like a game of poker. So apparently he was waving a poker around. So, okay, an example here is game. Wittgenstein says there is no essence of game. There's no Platonic abstraction game. The meaning of game is just how we use it, right? Look, games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, what's common to them all? Don't be like Plato. Don't say there must be something in common, or they would not be called games. Just look how we actually use language and see whether there's anything common to all games. Or if you look at them, you'll not see something common to all. You'll see similarities, relationships, a series of them, right? Don't overthink it, don't theorize, just look at how we use the word game. And the result is a network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing. Sometimes overall, sometimes similarities of detail. Right, so the idea is like, look, we're not consistent in our usage of game, and that's fine because it doesn't refer to some Platonic entity. Right? Hockey is a game, but we don't call it the track and field games, really. Right? We don't call it the rock climbing games. It's a sport. Is there a difference between a sport and a game? I don't know. We're imprecise in language for historical reasons, for etymological reasons, for convenience reasons. Yeah, I can imagine a government saying we're going to subsidize games, but what does that even mean? And then a lawyer is going to have to come up with a definition of game for legal reasons. But ordinary people are not going to be beholden to the legal definition, because the legal world is its own thing, right? But the ordinary language world just evolves and changes as a result of what we're actually doing. So you can think of things all games have in common, right? Can you, though? We start listing features, like maybe games have rules, maybe they have players, maybe they're competitive, there's a winner and a loser, there are teams. But do all games have teams? No. Do all games have winners and losers? Well, no. Like, my kids play tag at the park, but no one wins or loses at tag. You just tag each other and run around. That's a game. Do all games have players? A lot of games have players, plural, but solitaire is a game you play by yourself. All right, all games have rules, you could say. Well, some games only have rules really, really loosely. Like a lot of kids' games, you kind of make up the rules as you go. And not everything that has a rule has rules is a game. It's not like there are rules. There's Robert's Rules of Order if you're in a political meeting, but Congress is not a game. All right, so there's no one set of features that encompass everything we call game, and that's normal. What we have, Wittgenstein says, is kind of a family resemblance, right? If you have, I can imagine 10 features games have, right? The rules and players, winners and losers sometimes, and then generally what happens in language is that if you hit, out of the 10, if you hit like any 3 or 4 of them, we might start calling it a game, unless there are historical reasons we don't. But that's not a satisfying philosophical theory of games. That's just like a sociolinguistic analysis of usage. And Wittgenstein says that's all there is. That's where you stop. Right? And in the Blue Book, he kind of says, look, when Plato does philosophy, when Socrates is asking after the essence of games, there's a craving for generality. Right? To look for something in common to all that entities which we can subsume under a general term, right? The search for universals. Like when Socrates is like, you gave me lots of examples of justice, but what is justice itself? And we're inclined to think there must be something in common to all games, to everything just, and that this common property is a justification for applying the general term games. But he says, no, that's not right. Games form a family, from the members of which have family likenesses, right? It's kind of like we have features, and if you meet enough of the features, you might be joining the family. But ordinary language can't really be improved. So really, this is a deeply anti-Platonic conception of language that rejects representationism. And this is a radical act, because Wittgenstein's going to say a lot of philosophical puzzles arise from the misuse of language, to try and do theory to ordinary language, to assume language must picture reality, and that the goal of philosophy is to understand the nature of this picturing, to understand the nature of our concepts and what our concepts refer to, whether they're Platonic entities or whatever. But you can't do this. And if you don't do this, there's not a whole lot of philosophy left to do. And yeah, I mean, okay, I have a lot of slides about this. There's use, not Platonism. I'm going to skip some of these because I think I've been shouting for 40 minutes already, and I still have one more philosopher I want to talk about. But you can look at these slides if you're interested in Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein claims, kind of the big claim here, and it ramifies in a lot of different directions. His big claim is that all philosophical problems arise because we analyze ordinary language as if we can have a theory of all the concepts we use, but we shouldn't. All we need to do is just kind of be careful observers of our usage. Concepts are not determinate. There are not abstract entities. They don't refer to real things out there most of the time, unless you're doing science, but then you're going to not be using ordinary language. You'll be using scientific language, which is another thing. So concepts that we use are not abstract Platonic entities. At best, they're made of clusters of features that evolve according to our needs or way of life, right? There's no reason to think that even something like to know means there's a real mental process to know that is itself fundamentally linked to a Platonic capital K concept to know. So philosophical analysis, philosophical theories will fail to solve problems or answer questions. What we should learn is to unask these questions, to stop doing philosophy the wrong way. That's Wittgenstein, anyway. Okay. So, logical positivism, very influential in the first half of the 20th century, but kind of abandoned in the post-war period. Wittgenstein's critique helped, kind of branched off and did its own thing. But there's also problems that were very hard to deal with, like, how do you verify that meanings are verification conditions? Well, oops, right? It turns out that you can't get all of scientific theorizing out of just logic and observation. It was very hard to formalize induction, for example. There's a great book. Do I have it somewhere? Who amongst you is going to go read like a very long book about logical positivism? I have it. The Cambridge Companion to Logical Empiricism. Forget it. If you want to know more about logical positivism and its critique and its kind of like abandonment, I would say, but it still exists. But send me an email. The point is, a lot of kind of metaphysics returned to analytic philosophy after like a 50-year-ish kind of hiatus. One of the ways it made a return was through logic, ironically enough. Specifically a contribution made by Ruth Barkin Marcus and Saul Kripke on the logic of necessity and contingency, the logic of what could be and what could not be. So here's an example of kind of, again, logic and metaphysics kind of coming back in a weird way. So Russell said that the meaning, so early analytic philosophers like Russell defended variants of a view called descriptivism. Descriptivism is a view about language, because we're back in the view that language pictures reality. How does language picture reality? Well, it uses words. How do words work in picturing? Well, they refer to things. They point to things, or they talk about things. How do they talk about things? Well, that's a good question. Russell said, take names. How do names work? Take a name like Obama. How does Obama refer to a thing in the world? Well, mentally, I have a set of associated properties, or maybe socially, we have a set of associated properties, and that some object in the world satisfies that set of properties. So the Obama, in my head, I have, okay, 44th president, elected in 2008, first African-American president, and then I look out of the world, I have these properties, and I look into the world, and I try to observe and see what object in the world satisfies all these properties. Now, Kripke says, hold on. The meaning of the name can't be the set of descriptive conditions, the set of properties you think the name has. And let me tell you why. Because if the meaning of Obama was a list of properties, these properties would be necessary. But it's obviously not necessary. It's contingent. It's not a necessary fact that Obama was the 44th president. Obama would still have been Obama if he'd lost that election. Right? Obama would still be Obama, for that matter, if there was a forgotten president. Right? Oh yeah, after between Andrew Jackson and Cleveland, whatever, there was a hidden president. So Obama's actually the 45th president. Okay, so Obama's still Obama even if he's not the 44th president, right? So he's not identical to whatever objects satisfies properties we associate with him, right? The meaning of the name can't be the facts we associate with the name, because we could be wrong about that guy, Obama. I just have wrong beliefs about the properties I associate with him. So if we make contingent properties a necessary aspect of the name, we've made some kind of logical mistake, right? Because Obama would still be Obama even if he didn't have these properties, right? Everything, suppose there's a quantum leap, Rick and Morty possible world where, Obama dies as a small baby. It's awful example. And he doesn't do any of the things I think of him as having had done: becoming president, winning a second term, going to Harvard. He's still, right, so he has none of the properties. I don't know anything about baby Obama, but the possible world where baby Obama dies is still a world where Obama's Obama, even though he doesn't have any of his properties. So Kripke is saying Russell's theory is not right as a function of the logic of necessity and contingency, because you can't make these properties necessary. Kripke says, here's how language pictures reality, right? They refer directly via like a causal chain of usage that goes back to the specific named individual, even if everything we believe about that specific individual is wrong. So a name isn't a set of properties. A name is just a pointer. It's just pointing at the guy. How am I doing for time? 47 minutes. I got to wrap this up. So Kripke versus Russell here. How does metaphysics come back in? So Russell said names, proper names, are hidden descriptions. Who we refer to is whoever satisfies a set of associated characteristics. Right? Kripke disagrees. Names refer directly, not through characteristics. So Russell is wrong. And Kripke's argument turns on this idea of necessity. When something is necessary, it's true in all possible worlds, which is kind of like, if you ever, lots of movies, Quantum Leap, lots of TV shows play with this idea that there are multiple branching realities. So Kripke says, here's how you should understand necessity. Necessity is something true in all possible realities, right? There's no possible reality where 2 plus 2 isn't 4, you would say. The numbers might have different labels, but that doesn't change the math. 2 plus 2 is always 4 in all realities. Now, Kripke created like a logic that could handle propositions about necessity and contingency. I wish I could get into you about modal logic, but it's way too complicated. I studied this stuff in grad school. We're not going to do it. But how do you get into weird metaphysics through this logic? Well, Kripke's going to say, if you think about necessity and possibility, you'll actually get pretty strong constraints about how language deals with reality. And again, as a fan of Wittgenstein, I really fundamentally dislike Kripke. And in fact, I wrote my whole PhD roughly on why I disagree with Kripke about this. But Kripke's theory says, look, suppose you're in some other possible world, and right, you use your Rick and Morty portal gun. If you know, it's not the greatest. The 4th season is not that great, but you use your Rick and Morty portal gun, your quantum leap. You go into another possible world, another reality. And you land on the planet, and you look around. There's wet stuff in lakes. Looks like water. It rains wet stuff, and you're like, yeah. You taste it, and it quenches your thirst. And you're like, oh, well, this is pretty cool. So this planet has water in it. Then you analyze it. You go, like, use your little device, and you go, like, turns out it's not H2O. It looks like water, tastes like water, smells like water. You get that essence of petrichor when it rains on the street, but it's some other chemical compound. XYZ. You don't, right? It's this is crazy. It looks just like water, but it's actually XYZ. So if that wet stuff isn't water, then we get a really interesting claim. Water is necessarily H2O. In all possible worlds, water refers all and only to H2O, and that seems like a metaphysical conclusion, right? We've discovered something. Water necessarily is H2O, because there's no possible world where there's a XYZ called water, right? Wittgenstein is wrong. Words have stable necessary meanings. Water necessarily is H2O, because in a possible world, wet stuff is XYZ. We'd say, huh, I thought this was water, but it's not actually water, it's some other stuff. But if in all possible worlds where water is in H2O, we don't have water, then water necessarily is H2O. Boom! Essences. Right? We're back to stable necessary meanings. Not exactly Platonism, but something pretty close. Right? Here's another metaphysical argument. I'm going to close with this one. I'm sorry, it's a little bit longer than usual, but this analytic stuff can be a little, I would say, both dry and technical and fascinating if you're in the right mindset. If you're a little like Sheldon-esque, I guess. So another Kripkean argument goes kind of like this. Necessary truths are truths in all possible worlds. Kripke is going to say any and all identity statements, statements that two things are identical, are actually necessary truths. All right, so if I say Dwayne Johnson is The Rock, necessarily Dwayne Johnson is The Rock, because there's no possible world, there's no alternate reality where there's Dwayne Johnson and there's The Rock, two separate and distinct individuals. All right, because he's the same person. All right. So all identity claims are necessary, because there's no possible world where the identity can come apart. Right? How could it be? Because then if you'd have two other entities, right? But what we're really saying is, if we're saying two things are identical, we're saying there's only one thing. So in the possible world, there's two things. Either one or the other is it, but you can't split one thing into two like that, right? So all identity statements are necessary, right? I could find out that Dwayne Johnson is The Rock. I'd be like, gosh, I really like that Rock character. Oh, and I saw this movie with Dwayne Johnson. Like, Dwayne Johnson is The Rock. Whoa, mind is blown, right? But it was always true all along, and there's no possible world where there's a Rock and a Dwayne Johnson. So Kripke says, why don't we think about something more interesting than Dwayne Johnson and The Rock? He never said that. He said, look, is consciousness identical to your material brain states? If so, right, if consciousness is identical to the brain, you shouldn't have consciousness without the brain or a brain without consciousness. Kripke claims, however, that he thinks it's possible. It's possible to have consciousness without the brain or brain without consciousness. Right? And as a result, consciousness is not identical to the material brain. And to a positivist, you might think this is weird. How could a logical argument about necessity show something about reality? Well, because I would obviously say it can't. But Kripke says he can conceive of and as a function of logic, it's not logically impossible to have a exactly materially configured human being, right? That's a zombie with no internal life. And we call these a philosophical zombie. That you can have. There's something kind of nothing logically contradictory about imagining a brain without a consciousness. Personally, I don't have this intuition. So the argument goes like this. If two things are identical, they're in fact the same thing. If mind is in fact identical to brain, you can't have a mind without a brain or a brain without a mind. But Kripke says it's possible to have a brain without mind, showing that mind cannot be identical. That's a zombie argument. And I'm wondering what you think of that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this argument because I don't have the strong intuition that you can have a configured brain without a mind. But I think there's a video that kind of goes into it, right? But the idea of a philosophical zombie is really that you can have like a creature otherwise identical to a human without conscious experience, right? Like my smartphone can take a picture but doesn't have an experience of color. So the argument here is that it's logically possible to conceive of, there's nothing contradictory to conceiving of a brain that's not conscious. That a brain just kind of going through the configuration of being a human but doesn't have the subjective experience. And if it's not logically impossible, then brains and minds must be distinct. All right, there's a video about that. I think it's really interesting. Okay. I'm just going to cut it short here because I've been talking for an hour. I have another class live stream to do. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email. I'll be glad to answer, and I'll hopefully be back Thursday for week 12 on continental philosophy, where it's going to be hopefully a little bit more exciting, little less dry, a little less technical. All right, thanks so much for watching.